Okay, so we are back and we have now reached the second book of the Bible, Exodus. We have been taking our time kind of walking chapter by chapter through the Bible. And so we have covered Genesis. Check out those videos if you haven't had them. If you are ready to start here, there are two recaps kind of where you find it in Genesis. Two videos that give you a recap over the 50 books of Genesis. 50 chapters of Genesis. So we are jumping into Exodus. Exodus, we're going to cover chapter 1. It's verses 1 through 22. When we hear Exodus, a lot of times we always think and focus and hear exit. Exodus, exit. We hear that. We know that this is the exit, the departure. This is where the Israelites leave the Egypt that they moved into during the famine some many years ago. And the Israelites are in fact the children of Jacob, or Israel, as his name was changed into. So the Israelites are, for what we're discussing at this time, a family. It is a family. Each of his sons have sons who have sons who have sons. So we are looking now at this kind of legacy that has been built from the children that Jacob had and took with him into Egypt. So to recap very quickly where we left off so we can understand where we're starting, there was a famine in the land. This famine was accurately read as a dream, through a dream that the king had at the time. The king brought Joseph in to interpret the dream and create a plan of action that's going to save the people. Joseph, because of the Spirit of God on him, is able to interpret this dream, create the strategy, save the people. Over this time, as the people were saved, other countries and people would come and would stay. And Joseph's family, who is led by his father, Jacob or Israel, is one of those groups that come into Egypt at that time. And when they come in, they live in a city outside of Egypt, in Goshen. And they stay there for many years. They get comfortable. They are, start to raise families there. They never move back to the land that they were at before. Also in Genesis, some many years prior, Abraham, who was given the promise or the blessing from God originally, that he was going to be the father of many nations. He was going to be the leader of these people that God is calling. He's going to be the patriarch of this family that God is creating, who he has called to himself to be his own people. He was told that there would be a period of 400 years where his people would be enslaved. They would be in bondage. They would be held. And this is the start. We're getting ready to jump into those 400 years, that time frame of slavery or bondage that his people would be into. But God promised that he would bring them out. That promise is repeated when Jacob or Israel moves into Egypt with his family during the famine. And God says, I'm promising that I'm bringing you in as a family. I'm going to bring you out. And that is in fact what happens. And so we're going to look at the journey. Don't think Exodus, exit, think the journey. This is the path in and the path out, because we do talk about some things that happen while they're there. So we're going to get started in verses 1 through 7. It's literally a recap of the descendants of Israel or Jacob. So these are his children, his sons: Reuben, Simeon, Levi, Judah, Issachar, Zebulun, Benjamin, Dan, Naphtali, Gad, and Asher. They all go into Egypt. Joseph was already in Egypt. And so it says that in verse 5, there were 70 souls. 70 people is the amount that goes in. The reason why that is recorded in both Genesis and Exodus is because we need to know how many people went in so we can understand the miracle of how many people came out. And so in verse 6 is kind of where all the trouble begins. And it says that Joseph and all his brothers in that generation have died. So there is a time where everybody comes in. These are young men in their 30s and 40s. They have families and things like that. But now they've gotten older and they've passed on. And once they die, the new generations take over. Their sons now have families. And so the legacy continues, but there's now new living patriarchs. And so in verse 7, it says the children of Israel were very fruitful and they increased abundantly. They were having babies, and they were having babies upon babies upon babies. And so their numbers began to grow. When there is a blessing for being fruitful and being able to multiply, when there is a blessing for this kind of growth, because God said, I'm going to make, these people a nation. I'm going to make nations of nations. Like, it's going to be a whole lot of people. He promised Abraham that his children would be as numerous as the stars in the sky, as numerous as the dust on the earth. He promised him those things. So this is how we're getting to be, level of dust. This is how we're getting to star number. Is that they continue to have babies. And as they're growing faster than they're dying. Their generations are increasing in multiples. And versus, every time there's a baby born, there's a person that leaves this earth. That's some kind of belief that we have. I don't know who decided that, but that's not how it works. There's not like this finite number of souls that are only allowed to be here. There's not a trade-off. And so here they're growing and they're having children faster than they're growing old and passing on. And so it said that the land was becoming filled with them. It's so many people. They are other people around, other kings are noticing how large this group is. And so in verse 8, Egypt gets a new king. And this new king doesn't know Joseph. All he knows is, I got a bunch of Hebrews living on my land, sucking up all the resources and being really, really great in number and growing. And he becomes fearful of that number. He believes that, they're stronger, they're bigger. There's a lot more of them. At some point, they're going to outnumber us and they're going to take over. And what I don't need is a coup on my time frame. I don't need for the government to be overthrown while I'm in charge. So I have to do something to stop this from happening. And so it is important first that it says that he didn't know Joseph. Sometimes we are in positions and we hold a space that is ours because of who our parents or grandparents were, who our family is, the name and reputation that we carry. And there comes a time when that name and that reputation no longer holds relevance. So you got to have something else to stand on, okay? You can't just be out here saying, oh no, I'm a such and such. The name doesn't carry the same weight that it once had. There's not as much value to it. So make sure that you have something else to stand on, okay? So that you're not out here with your name being hungry. And so it says in verse 10, it said, come on, let us deal with them wisely. Wisely is the key word here. Let us deal wisely with them. And what he's saying is, we got to figure out a plan so that we can outsmart them, that we can outstrong them, that we can beat them at this. I have to figure out a way that we're going to make some political move here. And it's not necessarily let us be fair to them, let us talk to them, let us work out something with them so that we can live together peacefully. It is 100%, when he's saying wisely, it's like, let's outsmart them. And so he needs to do it because at some point he recognizes that they're going to multiply and be higher in numbers than they are. He's like, look, you cannot outgrow us in our own land. And he's saying and he starts hyping up the crowd. He goes to his advisors, he goes to the other leaders, his other people in, government positions. And it's like, all right, let's figure out how we're going to do this. Because he says at some point they're going to get big enough and they're going to want what we have. So they're going to join with our enemies to take this land. Or they're going to come up and fight against us on their own. And there's so many of them that we're not going to be able to win this fight. They're strong, they're mighty, we see them, and they're not going to win this fight. So what he says is, in verse 11, that they did set over them taskmasters to afflict them. They put them into slavery. That was his plan. Let me beat them by beating them down. If I make them work for us and hold them in bondage, make them servants to us, then I can demoralize them enough that they're going to go home and just not want to be around each other. They're going to be demoralized to a point that when they get back to their personal private spaces, the men won't feel the value that they did before, and they're going to turn on each other, and they're not going to have happy homes. They're not going to have these spaces. They're not going to want to have more babies because now you can't provide for them. Now you can't give them the life of freedom. You can't give them the life you wanted to give them. So they decided slavery is the way to fix this. Let's make them servants to us. And this is not the slavery that was kind of detailed in Genesis, which was a way to repay a debt where you would just work off a debt. Like, Genesis version, when God was talking about it, was more like, your kid is playing and they break a window and the window costs $120 to fix. So they have to like do odd jobs to earn $125 because they don't have real jobs. They don't have real money. Or, that's the way that it was mentioned in the Genesis slavery. This is different. This is more along the lines of the American slavery that we saw when blacks were enslaved in the U.S. And they built an entire country on their own backs for free because this is the way that somebody else decided it should work. And it says, in fact, in verse 11, that they set taskmasters over them to afflict them with their burdens, and they built for Pharaoh treasure cities. This is the difference. This is more like American slavery and what we've been taught. And I'm not gonna say what we've been taught. Some of us got some weird stuff, but this is what we know as American slavery. This is now modeling more of that. And they, in fact, built cities the same way that blacks in America built these cities. They built these plantations. They built these economies, built this entire country literally on their backs. And this is what is happening here. And it says that the more they afflicted him, the more they grew, the more they multiplied. Sorry. And it says they were grieved. Now, at this point, Pharaoh has hyped the people up so much, thinking that these people are going to be greater than us and it's going to be a war and it's going to be problems. He's hyped it up to the point where now the people are afraid. And they are grieved. They are worried that this is getting ready to turn into a thing. And so they pushed him even harder to work harder. So if I can't beat you mentally, let me see if I can beat you physically. And so what they attempted to do was now push him to the point of exhaustion. So they would come home and have no choice but to sleep. Ain't no time to, enjoy your wife. It's no time to snuggle up with your husband. There's no time for that because now you have worked an 18-hour day instead of a 12-hour day. Now you are we've pushed you to do things that are beyond the strength that you should have. So now, you don't have the energy or effort to go home and make more babies. And they made them bitter. They made them do all types of service. They are now doing physical labor that might be beneath them. You have to understand that this is a nation of people. They live in a separate city. They have doctors. They have lawyers. They have priests. They have pharmacists and ironsmiths and all these other things. All these trades that have existed in other cities exist there. They didn't just rely on Egypt for everything. They existed in their own space as well. They have their own giftings and talents and stuff. And so now they're being removed from these positions of doctor, lawyer, counselor, teacher. They're removed from these professions and now they're put into these hard labor-ridden jobs that they may not have already been in. And so they have to do all this stuff and they make them serve with rigor. This is an emphasis on how badly they were oppressed, how beaten down they were being. This is no longer, and it seems like the more that he beat them down, the more that he did, he had to keep going harder and harder and harder because people were just living in that and excelling and still having babies. And so in verse 15, it says that the king spoke to these two midwives. They were Hebrew midwives. And the midwives are basically what we would have is now people who deliver babies. And so he spoke to the midwives and were like, look, when the babies are born, as these women are laboring, if it is in fact a boy that is born, kill it. If it's a girl, let it live. If it's a boy, kill it. If it's a girl, let it live. Now, when you look at this, it just seems kind of crazy because how dare you, sir? Why would you allow the girls to live and kill off the boys? One, in the culture, if you are a male and you take a family, your family, like now, they get your last name, they accept your kind of background, your culture, your religion, it follows the father. The women marry into these families. So if they have only daughters, or only their daughters are able to survive, there will be a generation of women who cannot multiply because there's no men. And these women would now have to marry into the Egyptians. They would find favorable husbands. They would partner these people. And so now they would thin the herd by killing off the men and marrying their daughters. So they are effectively kind of funneling the women into the Egyptian culture to kind of be absorbed in that culture and not necessarily allowing them. So they were kind of trying to cut it off at the point of life beginning. And so he went to two Hebrew midwives, and it's really interesting because it says the king of Egypt, but in verse 16 it says that he talked to the two midwives. I'm sorry, in verse 15 he talks to the two midwives and gives their names. So they named the two women, ladies. I want everybody, and not even ladies, I want everybody to hear and understand this, that they named the two women who um they named the two women in here literally by name, and they just said the king of Egypt. The Pharaoh said, like, it was kind of what he was saying and doing wasn't as important as what the women do in this particular passage. And so I really want us to get that. A lot of times in our culture and learning, that women kind of go unspoken in the Bible. God did not leave us out. God did not decide that the work that they were doing didn't have value. They were midwives. Their jobs are literally just to get babies into the earth, put them together, smack their bottom, make sure they breathe, and give them to their parents. They were effectively, these two women are effectively doctors. They are medically trained. They have a role in society and life, and they are important enough that the king called them by name. The king called them by name. Slave women. He called them by name and gave them an assignment, and his name wasn't recorded. God said, write down the names of these two women because they were faithful to me. And here's how they were faithful to God. The king said, if it's a boy, kill it. If it's a girl, let it live. But they feared God, and they was like, what I'm not going to do is go against the God. I'm not going to kill no babies that he asked me to bring into this earth. He gave me this gift. He gave me this skill. He gave me this job and this occupation, and I'm going to do it right. And so what they did was they kept them babies alive. They did what they were supposed to do. They brought them into the world. They assisted and trained the mothers to make sure that these kids were cared for properly. And when it seemed like the children were just continuing to increase in number, and they were still allowed to they were allowing these babies to live, and it just kept he noticed that there was no change in the population. He's noticing that there's no decrease in the way that it should be. He's seeing little baby boys in places, and he was trying to do this kind of in secret. If the midwives can kill off the boys, and they'll think that there's something wrong with their sons, they'll think that there's something wrong with the babies. It won't be an obvious tactic to kill. It was a secretive thing. And so he calls him back in and was like, hey, what's going on? I'm noticing that there's little boys running around here. I'm seeing I'm seeing blue blankets and I'm seeing baby boys. What's going on? What happened to what I told you? And they said, look, these Hebrew women are strong and vigorous. They having these babies real easy. In fact, they having the babies before we can even get there. So I can't do anything in secret because they know the babies have lived. They've heard the cry. They've been able to hold on to them and nurse them while we come to care for them after the fact. Like they're having their babies too fast. There's not enough time for us to get there and kind of kill off these babies beforehand. And it says in verse 20 that God dealt well with the midwives and the people multiplied. And it says, and it came to pass because the midwives feared God, that he made them houses. He allowed them to have families of their own. They had a choice. They could have done what Pharaoh said, or they could have feared the Lord. And they could have done what they were asked to do, or they could do what they did and allow these children to live. God honored their obedience. First, he said, give them their own families. He did not cut them off. He didn't cause them to become infertile so they would have a stigma or they would have their own issues or headache or heartbreak. He didn't cause any of those things to happen. He in fact blessed them and gave them families of their own for their obedience. And he said, write their names down. And so he said, write them down. So we're going to say them. Shifra and Puah were their names. And they get honored in this. And I just want us to really know that, because sometimes we really think that the stuff that we do is minor. The stuff that we are involved in is minor. And our small stands for God are unnoticed. All they did was birth babies. Now, did God reward them because they lied to the Pharaoh? No, the reward was not because they lied to Pharaoh about what happened. Their reward was because they feared God, because their hearts were right. There was a fear for God, and they cared more about what God thought about them than what they thought about Pharaoh thinking. They feared God more than they feared the fact that Pharaoh would be like, oh, y'all ain't killing the babies, off with their heads. They had a greater fear of God than man, and that's where we need to be. We need to be more concerned about what God says about our actions and our thoughts than what people say. Now, verse 22 kind of stands on its own, and I want to say it in the way that it's said. So Pharaoh charged all his people. Pharaoh charged all his people, saying, every son that is born, you shall cast into the river, and every daughter you shall save alive. Pharaoh charged all his people. He sent out basically a decree. He talked to everyone. This is a rule for the Egyptians. Everybody that is under the rule, Hebrews included, everybody who is under the authority of Egypt. If you see an Egyptian boy, if you see a boy that is born, toss him into the Nile. Because now he didn't involve everybody. It's not just the midwives anymore. It's no longer a small kind of whispered secret thing. Do it while they're being born and nobody notices. They're going to think it was a birth accident. They're going to think he was stillborn. Like, instead of it being that situation, he's like, hey, you see a baby boy, throw him in the river. Take him out. I don't care what you got to do. Like, he put an all-out hit on baby boys. If it's a girl, she's safe. But if it's a boy, take him out. There was an attack even then. There was a threat. He put a hit out on every baby boy. He did not say every Hebrew boy. He wanted to make sure he got the Hebrews. He was willing to hurt himself to win against an imagined foe. Because I don't know why he never decided, hey, they're so mighty, they're so great in number. Why don't we become allies? Why don't we intermarry? Why don't we combine our cultures or something like that? They stood 10 toes down on this thing, and we see how it comes to their destruction. So, quick recap, and we're going to close this out. So it starts off, this is the first chapter of Exodus, and Exodus is the journey. We don't want to focus on the departure. We don't want to focus on the exit. This is a journey out. This is the path out. And so it highlights how many people came into Egypt with Jacob, and it lists all of his sons, and it's 70 people in total that go into Egypt because Joseph was already there. Then after Joseph and all his brothers die, a new king comes who did not know him. You got that new manager who don't know how things run. They don't know who's in charge. They don't know the unofficial and official leaders. They don't know this. So they come in with all these new rules and start messing with stuff. And they, of course, get, they're a little intimidated by the person that's been there for 30 years who knows their job and just wants to do their job. That's what's happening here. He came in as a new king and decided, oh, it's time for me to shake this thing up. And so he realizes and he sees that there is a group of people who are large in number and growing, and he feels intimidated by them. So he decides, we got to take them out. And so he starts doing little things trying to get rid of them. First, let's make them slaves. Let's oppress them. Okay, they're still having babies. They're still growing. And so there is, obviously, if they're still growing and still having babies, this is meaning a period of time is passing. These are years that are passing that he's seeing that there's no change in his tactics. So he doubles down, make them work a little harder. Not a 10-hour day, give them a 12-hour day. 12 hours ain't working, give them 18 hours. They're still out here, living life, enjoying. That's cool. Pull back some of the stuff that we giving them to do. Make them do more work. Not just they got to work for cheap. They got to work for free. But now they have to do manual labor. Pull them teachers out the classrooms and make them build bricks. Because teachers not built for that. He's telling them now, let's make it harder. And it didn't matter. No matter how much they beat down or oppressed them or afflicted them, it didn't work. It wasn't making a difference. So he was like, cool, don't worry, I got something else. He said, midwives, I want y'all to come. And I want you to kill off every baby boy as he's being born. Don't give him even a chance to cry. Take him out immediately. These midwives is like, I fear God more than I fear you, sir. Will not. And they didn't. And so they go through, and he calls them out and was like, hey, what's going on? I'm noticing that these babies are still here. And they say, no, we can't get to him in time. It don't work out. Your plan isn't working. They give him an excuse on why it isn't done. And in turn, because of their obedience, because of their fear of God, God rewards them because they had the opportunity to do what Pharaoh asked. And they could have been rewarded by Pharaoh, but they were instead rewarded by God. And I would much rather have the reward from God than from man. Man can give me what he has in his hands. God can create some stuff for me. So they stood on their respect, their reverential fear of God, and were rewarded by God. And so after that, Pharaoh said, "Cool. At this point, it's an all-out hit. Baby boy's gotta go." And he told everybody, if you see a baby boy, throw him into the Nile. Do not let him live. If it's a girl, they can live, but if it's a boy, no. So at this point, he stopped trying to whisper and be secretive about his plan. He just out and out said it. So I just want to caution you guys and help you to remember that when that new manager shows up and is wreaking havoc, tearing apart the systems that y'all put in place, who is giving everybody a headache and a heartache and is just foolish in nature, do not worry. God got you. It seems crazy and it's getting ready to get crazier. Trust me, we gonna have this path with the Egyptians and the Israelites. It's gonna get real crazy. But the reality is, it's all done for a purpose. God is giving you an opportunity to shine His light in this situation, so that when you come out, people are gonna follow your light right out, and you'll be able to draw people to God. You'll be able to win souls for Him by being obedient and fearing God in the middle of the crazy. So y'all stand strong and be blessed.